home rabbi with the refrigerator so near.
Yeah, I know, right? Oh, I got to see the services from your perspective. Gosh, that rabbi that we have, he talks a lot, way too much. Um, uh, my apologies to all of you. Hopefully, y'all have enjoyed our services, though.
Yes.
Um, okay. Well, it's 1:33 now, so we'll get started. I'm sure we'll have some more people joining us. And we are going to be having two speakers today who are going to be talking uh, about things that are very relevant to both, I think, our Jewish values and the world we're in right now. I'd like to
What?
ask everyone to make sure that they're on mute. Um, Unless you're me or Dr. Windmueller for the moment. But our first speaker, so at 2:30, we're going to have our second speaker, Dr. Bruce Haynes, who will be talking a bit about African American history and the Jewish community. But our first speaker today is Dr. Stephen Windmueller. Some of you have gotten to know Dr. Windmueller because he actually, right before we went into shutdown, you were like our last big thing that we did. We had Dr. Windmueller come on a Friday night and present here at the synagogue, and I got great reviews about that, and people said, "Bring that guy back here." And he was one of my favorite professors that I had in rabbinical school. So I'll read you a little bio about him. Dr. Stephen Windmueller is the Rabbi Alfred Gottschalk Emeritus Professor of Jewish Communal Studies at the Jack H. Skirball campus of Hebrew Union College Jewish Institute of Religion in Los Angeles. Prior to coming to HUC, Dr. Windmueller had served on the staff of the American Jewish Committee from 1969 through 1972, directed the Albany, New York Jewish Federation from 1973 to 1985, and the JCRC Jewish Community Relations Committee of the Los Angeles Jewish Federation from 1985 to 1995. And I know he was in charge of overseeing President Clinton's, then President Clinton's visit to Los Angeles and speech at the Federation. During his tenure at the college, Dr. Windmueller served for 10 years as the director of its School of Jewish Nonprofit Management, and in 2005 was named to the deanship of the LA campus from 2006 to 2010. Between 2012 and 2014, he was invited to teach classes both at USC and the Nanjing University in China. The author of 4 books and numerous articles, Professor Windmueller holds a PhD in political science from the University of Pennsylvania. His research has been primarily focused on Jewish communal trends, anti-Semitism, and Jewish political behavior. His articles have appeared in a number of secular and Jewish publications. He is frequently quoted in the general and Jewish press. During this pandemic crisis, Dr. Windmueller has been devoting his research to examining the impact of the coronavirus on the American Jewish community. I will want to have you back for a future talk on that, I know. Currently, he is editing a volume for the Kasten Institute of USC on Donald Trump's impact on American Jews, scheduled for release in late spring of 2021. He is currently a board member of Hillel 818. We must have missed each other. I was on the board till I moved out here. Dr. Windmueller serves as a fellow of the Jerusalem Institute of Public Affairs and a board member of the Pat Brown Institute at Cal State Los Angeles. For the past 6 years, he has been on the faculty of the Memorial Foundation for Jewish Culture. And if I could make one, let me let another bunch of people in. If I can make a plug for as well. Dr. Windmueller and I are part of a dialogue group with Jewish scholars and also professors from Brigham Young University. And they just published a book that just came out. You can now get your copy. It is the first ever book that is jointly published by a Latter-day Saints publishing company and a Jewish publishing company, published by the CCAR Press and Brigham Young University Press. There's this book, Understanding Covenants and Communities, Jews and Latter-day Saints Dialogue, something that might be of interest to our community specifically. And Dr. Windmueller is a author for a number of the chapters. in this book. So I highly recommend it. My copy, as you can see, and you can get yours too. So Dr. Windmueller, without further ado, I would invite you to take it away, and please let me know when you want me to share screen.
Well, thank you, Rabbi Spector, and to the members of Congregation Kol Ami. Wishing each of you a easy fast and a happy and healthy new year. The topic of politics and religion seem to be at odds on a day such as this. But in many ways, I argue that it is precisely because we are asked to think about where we stand in the world, who we are, and what we represent in terms of our identities as Jews and as Americans. The prayer that we recite at the time of the reading of Torah, dealing with the prayer for our country, explicitly, I think, frames the basis for why this is an important issue for us as we ponder both ourself, our identities, and our standing. We think about it in the context of the larger society. This afternoon's presentation is designed to introduce the background to where Jews have taken their journey, as it has well been in the American story, and especially in light of the 2020 elections. We can now bring up our slide presentation. So moving to the second slide, I want to remind us that Jews have been part of the American story from the very beginning. In fact, the very first casualty in the Revolutionary War was Francis Salvador, a Jew from Spain who had volunteered for the army of Washington and who would be killed in one of the early battles. The point being that from the history of the American dream to its reality, Jews have been an integral part of this. Chaim Solomon, that many of you know, Mordecai Noah, an interesting and fascinating figure of the early 18th century, and numerous others, rabbis, journalists, and business persons, all would begin to create an American Jewish political story from the outset. But this story is also about pride and about ideas. The pride in being part of this dream, of this new story of democracy, has been an integral part to our history. And the pride factor affirmed and shared with us in the 2013 Pew study of how intensively American Jews take pride in being Jewish, as well as their pride in their Americanism. The next slide, please. Indeed, I have written a good deal about what I call the contract with America, that Jews have created a body of thought, law, and practice that resonates with them, whether it is the first amendment of the Constitution in terms of its religious, assembling, and speech clarifications, or whether it deals with the 6th article of the Constitution affirming that there is no religious test to become part of the political story. The American story is interesting because Maryland, New Hampshire, and other states restricted Jewish participation politically well into the 1800s, precisely because Jews would not be put of office on the New Testament, arguing that their faith tradition of the Old Testament affirmed their American and Jewish loyalties in a rich way. But it was the Civil War in many ways that would construct a kind of reaffirmation of the Jewish ties to this country. 8,000 of our men and women would serve in the Union Army, and an additional 6,000 would serve for the Confederacy. And Lincoln himself would become a unique hero to American Jews. They would memorialize him as he passes away from the assassination in 1865. He dies on Passover. And the sermons are extraordinary during that period, as our community mourns the loss of a national hero who was a builder of society. And the interesting piece to that is that from the mid-1860s to about 1912, American Jews saw in Lincoln and the Republican Party their birthplace, their home for much of their political connections. The very first Jew elected to Congress is David Yulee. He's elected in 1845. He's a member of the Senate from Florida. And in the same election, a young man from Pennsylvania assumes a seat in the House. But as you see in the current Congress alone, this significant number of participants from our community, 28 Jewish members, of whom 27 happen to be Democrats and 2 are Republicans, and 9 US senators, all of whom are Democrats. In 1993, we are reminded this was the largest numbers of Jews ever to serve in the Congress, but from 1840s moving forward, there have always been significant participants on the part of the Jewish community in the political process as members of the Congress, as cabinet members, as individuals deeply committed to the court systems and to other frames of governance. Next slide, please. So who votes in America? Well, that will be an interesting question, certainly in 2020. But the reality of asking this question is as much designed for us to realize that many Americans do not vote. In fact, no more than 60% of eligible voters are actually generally participating. Maine has a higher number, 72% of Maine's citizens eligible to vote are participating, but Hawaii's is around 40%, which reminds us of the fact that Jews vote in extraordinarily high numbers. Some have suggested as high as 85%, but various polling surveys tell us it's anywhere between 72 and 85%, which makes, therefore, our vote that much more powerful and impactful. Certainly, the role of money in politics has been a significant issue. It is generally conceded that 1/2 of all dollars raised by the Democratic Party in this country come from Jewish Americans, and 1/4 or 25% of all dollars raised by the GOP, the Republican Party, come from Jewish sources. In fact, my own work in 2016 demonstrates an interesting finding. Hillary Clinton's top 5 donors were Jewish Americans, and Donald Trump's 7 of his top 17 were Jewish Americans. So what will we expect this November? This will be amongst the most expensive elections in American history. I would remind you that the Romney-Obama election of 2012 was an election that cost $2.4 billion to carry forward, 1.2 basically from each side. Those numbers are no longer extraordinary, as we have seen the costs of winning elections and playing in the political field to be a major factor. And since Jews have historically been so engaged, this is an important understanding of their place and concern about candidacies and the outcomes. One of the interesting things about who will be voting and what the nature of the vote will be is that we are adding to our voter rolls every year something in the order of 4 million new voters as young Americans assume their place. So what we are expecting in 2020 is that we will move from roughly 139 million voters in this country to 150 million plus. And we will begin to see the impact of millennials and Generation Z voters as they begin to change and impact elections. Deeply concerned, as we all are, about protecting the vote, I think we all would agree that we can anticipate between now and November and into November, as the ballots are counted, a series of legislative as well as legal efforts to manage and deal with the challenges that will be raised around this election and voting. I would remind you that many American Jewish organizations who remain 501c3, which means nonpartisan and non-for-profit, are all issuing guidelines to their members about how and the best ways by which they can secure their ballots and deliver them to be counted. Next slide, please. What do we know about Jewish voters? We actually are beginning to learn a great deal. We've had 4 recent studies and many, of course, over time. one of the more interesting questions that has been raised in these studies is that where does Israel fit in the equation of Jewish concerns? This is a more complex question than it may sound, but in reality, Israel only plays to a relatively small part of the American Jewish audience. It plays higher should there have been a dispute between Washington and Jerusalem on some major questions of Israeli security or Israel's future. But generally, what we are seeing, and what I'm going to be telling German radio tomorrow when I do an interview with them, is precisely the fact that many other issues are dominant to American Jews that, in a sense, outweigh the question of Israel. We will come back to that in a few moments. I think this notion that I spoke about of Jewish contract and Jewish exceptionalism is why American Jews are seen as such high-profile voters. But how we vote is the interesting issue. The quote that you see here, Jews live like Episcopalians and vote like Puerto Ricans, is actually taken from an interesting statement by Milton Himmelfarb in 1973, when he took a look at the polling data of much of the 20th century up to that point and realized this pattern that Jews tend to vote very differently than their economic or class structure would suggest. And I would remind you, based on the New York Times exit poll, Hillary Clinton received about 71% of the Jewish vote in 2016, Donald Trump 24%. American few core areas, 8 states, they are listed here, and they account for 188 of the electoral votes. And that reflects the interesting reality that there are 17 major cities or communities in which most American Jews reside, and they account for roughly the most densely populated areas in the United States, as important a point to recall. I am going to point here to the Bagel Belt, because the Bagel Belt is now a conversation that the Republican Jewish Coalition and the Jewish Democratic Council are having about which Jewish voters really count in 2020. And this will be about some of these states that are posted here under Bagel Belt. And while the actual numbers of Jews living in these states may be somewhat smaller than the major 8, and include in the case of Florida a cross-referencing of both, the reality is that these Jewish voters are getting a huge amount of attention, because we know that while Jews account for 2% of the American population, they count for a much higher percentage of outcomes in terms of being who is going to vote. So we'll be watching and monitoring those states and those Jewish voters in particular. Next slide, please. Stepping back here, we're going to, in the next 2 slides, take a look at some interesting data of where we have been. Now, we could go all the way back because we have data going back to roughly the 1900 election, but we're going to take a look at the more recent years. And you will see certain general trends as you see the significant vote garnered by Democratic candidates through much of this period, but it ebbs and flows. And part of that is tied to the fact that particular issues in a particular campaign will drive voters elsewhere. And that is what we would see in some of these examples. Let's move to the next slide, please. In this slide, I want to call your attention to the 1980 election, because if you note Ronald Reagan's first campaign in 1980, where he nearly receives 40% of the Jewish vote, and where the Democrats, in the case of Jimmy Carter, does significantly less well than most Democratic candidates have and will continue to do based on what we know about American Jewish voting patterns. In the third column there, you see John Anderson, who was running as a third party, and he does extremely well amongst Jewish voters, garnering a high of 15%. And I would remind you, in the 1920s and 30s, socialist candidates running as third-party candidates also did extraordinarily well with Jewish voters, demonstrating again the impact of the many political ideas competing inside the Jewish community for political support. I would ask you to think about why then, in 1984, did Reagan fall off by 8 percentage points? And what happened in those 4 years? Well, the rise of the moral majority. In 1983, it was formally formed. In 1984, it, in a sense, played its first political card. And that scared a huge number of American Jews at the time in terms of what that would mean in terms of church-state separation or other questions about the role of religion in American political behavior. As you can tell, Barack Obama in 2008 scored 78% of the Jewish vote. He too drops 8 points or thereabouts, 9 points. From what we can tell, that loss was across the board. President Obama lost with women. He lost with various other minority and community groups. And part of that may have been tied to questions on Israel, and part of it were simply tied to other concerns raised over the first 4 years of the Obama presidency. Next slide. I think we want to step back here and take a look at the root systems of our traditions, political traditions, and there are certainly multiple numbers of them. Conservative political Jewish thought is a deeply embedded idea. It really is an old idea of European Jewish life. It is rooted there first and comes to the United States later, and it is brought and has brought with it a whole cadre of political thought that today has become kind of a body of literature that describes the thinking of why conservative Jewish political practice or behavior. And there are, in my mind, at least 5 kinds of Jewish conservatives or Republican conservatives, and they are reflected by the first group, which I have labeled identity politics, folks who basically say, I want to look at the political agenda from the best benefit of the Jewish people, the Jewish community, whether that is Israel, anti-Semitism, or other questions. A second group are the neoconservatives who really flourished during the period of the Reagan years and have been on the outs with parts of the Republican establishment since then, but their traditional model is to sort of be declarative of democracy, preserving certain traditional values that they hold to firmly in economic, cultural, and social terms. The third class are ideological conservatives who come to this whether about the role of government or questions about law and order or issues associated with national security. These groups, along with others, are a composite of an interesting collection of sources or viewpoints, Persian Jews, Russian Jews, Israeli Jews living in the United States, and other groups who have coalesced to create parts of these kinds of identities, along with millennials and other business class Americans who identify and support these principles as well. The religious value conservatives are really our Orthodox community, and they break into 2 parts. The ultra-Orthodox or Haredi community is 56% Republican-based. Modern Orthodox Jews have been roughly 29% Republican. Those numbers are likely to actually change in 2020. We believe that Donald Trump will do better with religious value conservatives. Some have projected as high as 68%. And the modern Orthodox will move from 29 to 36% as we see some shifts possibly there. Never Trump Republicans are particularly interesting because they did not vote for the president in many cases in 2016 and continue to raise concerns that he is not reflective of, in their mind, Republican values and the interests of the United States. So these are the 5 perspectives that I have on the behaviors of Republican Jews in America at this moment. Next slide, please. On American Jewish liberalism is actually a much newer phenomenon. It is a 20th century one in many ways. It is the combination of the old socialist models. It comes to us in part out of the European assimilationist expression. It is born as well out of the prophetic Jewish religious tradition, and it is this conglomerate of ideas about American Jewish thought and practice that is a kind of movable feast. That is, liberalism is not any one idea or theme. It tends to be, as Professor Mark Dollinger of San Francisco State has argued, it is a kind of storyline constantly in motion. So that there are many different dimensions to progressive Jewish thought. And I have labeled here 5 categories of Jewish Democrats or Jewish liberal voices. The universal progressives, who take the prophetic tradition to its full and extensive perspective. Liberal suburban Democrats, who pick and choose the kinds of issues that interest them, tend to be more conservative than maybe some of their progressive colleagues, and tend to vote pocketbook issues in state and local elections, but tend to vote ideologically in national elections. Urban activists is an interesting group because we are seeing a significant number of Jewish millennials shifting from being one party to independent voters. In other words, leaving either the Democratic or Republican Party to assume a kind of independence. And this is not unique to the Jewish community. We're seeing this as a trend in large city millennial culture over the last several elections. For me, amongst the most interesting of these subgroups is the red diaper babies. So who are these folks? These are the great-grandchildren, even the great-great-grandchildren of the old socialists. They are the Bernie Sanders supporters in 2016 who sat out the election because Bernie wasn't on the ticket. They are part of the anti-war movement of the Vietnam era. They are part of the socialist movement of the 1930s. They carry a kind of historical family tradition of being on the edge of the Democratic Party as the most outspoken critics of American politics and policy. Notice that the libertarians are here in the Democratic column. My colleague Herb Weisberg at Ohio State University in his new book has argued that Jewish libertarians, unlike Republican libertarians, belong here because they tend to agree with a lot of the social agendas, but don't necessarily see government as the vehicle or expression of how to achieve or accomplish that. So they represent a small but interesting subgroup that many of us are trying to study as a kind of interesting new voice within American Jewish politics. Next. So what can we expect as we move forward? This is an election, as we know, about this president in many ways. We are all familiar with the issues and concerns about disinformation, suppression, and foreign influence. And on foreign influence, I will tell you from the data that I have seen, there are some 10 countries that are seeking and have been seeking to penetrate this marketplace in terms of influencing ideas, changing attitudes, and disrupting the election. And of course, the large 3 are certainly China, Russia, and North Korea, but we see Iran, Venezuela, and others playing a role as well. Certainly, the ballot counting and the post office issues have already been examined by the larger media, but for American Jews, it certainly continues to be of concern. I think behind all of this is the American Jewish concern for the 2020 census, because the census provides the frame for the next 10 years of district management and of the numbers of allocated seats, as we know, both in the House and in state assemblies and legislatures. A very important outcome here, and which is why the Democrats and Republicans are fighting to achieve whatever outcomes they wish to. The most clear concern that many of us have on the part of the Jewish community is conspiracy theories and threats such as those that are exposed by these theories to belief systems that are totally and utterly false. And that has created a huge amount of anti-Semitic behavior, as well as a concern about really what happens if people act out on these theoretical or conspiracy notions. American Jews have always understood that trust was an important factor in building American civility and democracy. And so I am putting a good deal of focus on trust, because it means that the players all buy into the value of democracy. And when that implodes, and when people lose confidence in the society, That is a huge threat to the Jewish community in many ways, which we can talk about later if you so wish. I would remind you that the connection of Jews to the White House and to the Biden campaign are significant. The children of Joe Biden are married or were married to Jewish spouses, and we know the president is himself tied to a Jewish family through his son-in-law, and we know that the vice presidential nominee on the Democratic side, Kamala Harris's husband, Doug Emhoff, is a member of the Los Angeles Jewish community. I think the bottom line here as we look forward is really the impact of American popularism that has come forward in the last 4 years, but has been on the ground from the 19th century moving forward. It is an old idea that Andrew Jackson was amongst the first to sort of create for us. And it is a question of where we are headed. To those Americans who are unhappy and dissatisfied and no longer believe in the political system, or at least in its current manifestations, they want a road to somewhere that gives them rootedness, direction, and a security. Other Americans are more flexible and see us in a sort of changing global economy, in a world beset by climate change and a host of other threats, and that requires a different kind of roadmap than we've ever known before. And I think this is all the sort of question of why 2020 is so powerful and important, because it is about the state of democracy in America and throughout the world, as democracy is really in crisis in the world, as we see government after government in Eastern Europe and elsewhere really being challenged around its democratic principles and positions. And here I worry specifically about the rise of neo-Nazism in Germany, in Austria, and in other parts of Eastern Europe. Next slide, please. I mean, I think as we look forward to what is happening, I think we are looking at some major challenges before us. Jews who did not vote in 2016 and whether they will return to the ballot box in 2020. We believe that as many as 8 to 10% of young Jews did not vote, whether it was because Bernie Sanders was their candidate or whether they simply did not find in either of the choices someone they could believe in and support. I think the Orthodox community is an interesting model and is going to grow its political clout inside the Jewish community and certainly on the American political stage. I think that the left-right divide inside the Jewish community is the biggest story. It is the story of families not talking to family members, of Jews out of no longer in dialogue and discourse with other Jews. And the other factor is that from 2018 forward, we have seen this huge outpouring of political giving, of charitable giving to nonprofits and of political giving to candidates, causes, and institutions of American political life. Israel as a part of the divide issue is an interesting story, but is far less a prevalent one, as I've argued earlier. But the new story is anti-Semitism. And that is really the challenge of how social media will be held accountable as it continues to permit or has permitted a huge amount of misrepresentation and distortion in terms of Jews and other minorities. And that is a challenge as we go into this election. And I would remind you in 2018 and again in 2016, huge numbers of Jewish journalists faced significant pushback and anti-Semitic messaging against them for covering the campaigns as they did. The next slide, please. I think American Jewish clout is at its maximum at the moment. It will begin to diminish as American society changes, reminding ourselves the American public is going to change. We know that by the mid part of this century, that's not many years, 30 years away, America will no longer be a white society. It will be a multicultural and a collective set of institutions and communities that describe it in a very different way than we would see today. Islam will replace Judaism as the America's third largest religious community after Roman Catholicism and Protestantism. And that all is reflective about the changes that are coming to the Jewish community. We are amongst the oldest voting constituencies in the United States. And every study points to the fact that American Jewish voters pay a huge amount of attention to the issues of Medicare, to concerns about insurance, Social Security, and related issues, which is a natural phenomenon for a generation of Jews who are 65 and over. Our younger populations simply are not large enough to sustain the kind of presence and levels of participation that we have seen from previous generations. Political parties themselves are likely to go through huge changes, and I can talk more about that and its implications for the Jewish community should we have time. And certainly the impact of anti-Semitism. This is the first time in American history where we have at the very same moment anti-Semitism on the right and on the left. We have experienced it in one form or another. Today we have it in both camps. 64% of American Jews express the fact they are far more concerned about right-wing anti-Semitism. 16% indicate that their concerns are about the BDS movement and other anti-Israel, left-wing or leftist political attacks or actions. Next slide. I think as we move forward, these are some of the questions that I think we will be looking at for certain. What kind of leadership America will deliver for itself and the world beyond 2020, whoever wins this election, because the question will be about the future of political parties, the role of America in the world, and even certainly within this nation. The Supreme Court, which Jews take very seriously and view as one of the important measures by which they vote. So the court itself is a subject at the very moment, as we well know, for a high degree of attention and consideration. But I think this will be a challenging time for liberal American Jews, as it will be a more of an opportunity time for Republican Jews to, in a sense, move their agendas forward. I think that we will be spending the next 2 to 5 years in dealing with a effort to rebuild the economy, rethink our health system, reimagine our technologies, and having to revisit really the public square and how we manage a society that is deeply broken and divided. And a bottom line to that question is gun safety, and Jews weigh very deeply on this, as the Second Amendment is seen as sacred to many Republican voices, but to many Jewish Americans, it is seen as a measure that requires some degree of control and flexibility in how we understand the place of guns in our society. And as we move beyond the pandemic, I think we will be having to reflect on how we heal the society's deep wounds as a result of the last 6 months in terms of how the culture, economy, health system, and the street behaviors have all led to a weakening of the sense of a shared democracy. Next slide. These are the issues that American Jewish voters in a study that was completed this past 6 months are telling us what concerns them. We note that Israel is not a high priority, as I've noted, but here again, you will see the return to the aging factor of healthcare, the consistent factor of gun control and gun security, and the other issues that have historically been dominant on the stage of American Jewish interests. So I point to these as a kind of model of what drives Jewish voters who, whether Democrats or Republicans, often think about many of these questions. Next slide. I think as we conclude my formal remarks here that we pay particular attention to the changing American majority and what that will mean for Jews and how it's playing out in terms of behaviors and culture. That will be a longer term strategy question that the Jewish community will need to address. And the more short-term questions are really dealing with anti-Semitism and hate politics and the whiteness of American Jews. And this has been the charge. The alt-right charges us as being too white, trying to replace them and other whites. The far left sees us as pretenders, in a sense, claiming our historical role as victims of history, and now suddenly emerging as power players in a society in which, therefore, our credibility is lost and our whiteness is emphasized, and changing, therefore, the equation of where Jews fit into this political mix between right and left. I am hopeful that Jews will continue to be civically engaged, because that has been for us the reason that the contract with America has been successful and important, and is the basis for how we move forward. I'm going to conclude here. Welcome, as the rabbi has indicated, your chat room questions, and we'll take the next 15 minutes or so to try to delve into those.
Thank you so much, Dr. Windmueller. That was really interesting, as always. You know, I guess a question that I know a lot of people have is, and everybody else, while I'm asking my question, you can put yours in the chat, or if you don't feel comfortable, is there a chat? I don't know that there is a chat. I was supposed to have a chat. That might have been my mistake. Okay, sorry, my sin. You can raise your hand if you have a question. But I know that something that we have as a community been asking a lot about is what's been going on over this past month. Right before the 2016 election, we had the bombshell of the Access Hollywood tapes for then candidate Trump, and the Comey investigation for Secretary Clinton in literally a couple weeks before the election. And just this past few weeks, we've seen phenomenal historical peace deals that the Trump administration negotiated between Israel and 2 Gulf states. A lot of people wondering how that is going to affect the Jewish vote. And also then, of course, a couple hours before Rosh Hashanah, we had the very sad passing of Justice Ginsburg, which is going to dramatically change things here in our country. And then just a couple hours before Yom Kippur last night, this bombshell New York Times article on President Trump's taxes over the past 20 years. And so do you think any of those things, you know, there's also the Woodward interviews and stuff like that, there have been bombshell after bombshell coming out, and perhaps more to come out in the next few weeks leading up to the election. Do you think any of these will affect the election, or in particular the Jewish vote, especially as it relates to Justice Ginsburg and also the Israel deals?
Thank you, Rabbi. What we do know is that only 3 to 5% of American Jews are undecided in this election. Overall, in the American electorate, we believe as many as 8 to 10% of voters are undecided. But in the Jewish realm, most Jews have pretty well determined their place. We do see some shift from the actions taken by the United States on behalf of Israel in the Gulf region, mostly amongst some of the Orthodox Jews, which is why I cited the possibilities, if you may recall, of a higher number of supporters for the president among Haredi Jews in a recent study that seemed to indicate that that was clearly a positive factor to their voting. We will likely see it among other Republican types that I described earlier in terms of their potential for voting. I think we are in for some more surprises in October. There's no question there will be, at least from both sides, delivering wherever and whenever possible their interests in trying to make the last ditch impact or influence. As I said, you're seeing a huge amount of money in this election, and much of it is coming in now. We've seen a huge amount over the last 10 days. With the death of Supreme Court Justice Ruth Ginsburg, we saw the Biden campaign had its biggest weekend in its campaign history, and $140 million in a weekend alone of support for the campaign. The president's PAC is now actually doing very well. Just saw yesterday the data on the fundraising side on the Republican piece, and that is quite impressive. And the Republicans will be emphasizing, of course, states where they believe that will be critical for their victory. Florida, to be sure, as we know, Ohio, and Georgia. We are also going to see a huge amount of attention starting tomorrow night with the debates. The debate is a 90-minute affair. It is broken into 6 parts. It's going to be quite interesting. Each part is on a different theme. A part of it is on the Supreme Court. Part of it is on law and order. Part of it is going to deal with questions associated with the management of COVID-19. So we're likely to see a good deal of how that plays out in terms of reactions and to the voting, to American Jewish voting patterns. I think a longer term question will be about Black Lives Matter and the whole conversation that Jews and African Americans will need to have. And that will be part of the longer term issue of where Jews come out on some of these issues of reimagining urban life, criminal justice, and social concerns.
Thank you. And that's a great segue to our next speaker. But we have about 15 minutes of for questions that I know Dr. Windmueller has booked at a couple of synagogues today. He's a popular speaker. So are there, again, my apologies. I thought I had set up a chat, but apparently I disabled it. My mistake. If you have a question, how about you raise your hand, or just we can do it popcorn style. I saw Liz unmuted herself. Liz, do you have a question? Liz Page?
I do. Thank
Go
you.
for it.
I'm wondering what issues might sway Jews who have not voted did not vote in the last election to voting now.
Well, the odds are based on all the survey data, and there are 4 surveys that we basically have inside the Jewish community to look at, and all of them indicate that Donald Trump is really the sort of measuring issue. Either folks embrace him or oppose him, and those who oppose him are quite vigorous, meaning it's a high degree of energy and expectation on their part to express that. Not that they're necessarily demonstrating a high degree of commitment to the Vice President, to Joe Biden, but are clearly demonstrating an anguish and concern about the president. The second factor is that we believe the Supreme Court issue may actually generate and energize Jews on both sides. Those who certainly are concerned about Roe v. Wade or issues of healthcare, questions of civil liberties, church-state relationships and status. That will drive both Republicans and Democrats who may have been uncertain about where they want to go back into their home parks to support the candidate that reflects their ideological interests around the courts. So I think those are some examples of where we're likely to see that small number of Jews who remain undecided. I will tell you that weekly, those Jews in those the bagel states that I referenced are being called by friends of Joe Biden and friends of the president in terms of Jewish Democrats and Jewish Republicans working on these campaigns to create the momentum to win those votes, because in very tight elections, the Jewish vote certainly matters.
Thank you. I see Patrice had her hand up next, and then after Patrice, we'll go Rabbi Wenger, and then that will probably wrap up our time with Dr. Windmueller. So Patrice.
Thank you very much, and thank you for your really interesting presentation. A couple of things. First, you had talked about possible future changes in political parties and how that might impact on Judaism and Jewish involvement. I'd love to hear more about that. And also your thoughts on whether these trends will also impact down ticket races. You know, it's not just the presidency we're talking about some really important, particularly US Senate races.
First of all, to acknowledge who you are and your extraordinary contributions to your work as a part of the political community, but also as your concerns about the Jewish political voice and your role in managing that. Yes, you're absolutely correct. Certainly so much of this campaign is focused on the presidency, but the more important outcomes, or maybe as equally important outcomes, are the kinds of things happening down race or below that level. And the Senate is certainly where we would start. And the Senate races are key. Interestingly enough, we have a number of Jews running, both in some of these Senate races that are in contest and that are in play, as well as certainly Jews running in other slots and from House seats, in state government, state legislative roles, etc. So this is an ongoing phenomenon of seeing a growing number, by the way, of Jewish political activists. So I'm particularly interested, for example, in Alaska. The Democratic candidate, actually he's running as an independent, but he represents basically the a kind of voice against the incumbent Republican in the Senate from Alaska, is a physician. His name is Dr. Albert Gross, and he is running an interesting campaign in a very red state. We see in Wyoming an Israeli-American woman running, she's a former university professor, and again, an interesting campaign. We see in Georgia several Jewish candidates running, and we have them up and down the political spectrum in terms of on the Republican and Democratic side. We have some interesting races in the House that are both featuring Jewish candidates facing one another. So the point is well made that these are key elections, and we see a good deal of Jewish money being focused on a number of these races in Maine for the Senate, North Carolina for the Senate, Iowa, Kentucky, Georgia, and one or two other states which are seen as in play, including, of course, Arizona, where the Democratic candidate is married to former Congresswoman who is Jewish, and is a interesting race unto itself, as Arizona is a highly contested state with a very rapidly changing voter base, and a state that a lot of us are really curious to see what will happen.
Thank you. And we have time for one more question. Rabbi Wenger, I'll give you the final question. Kvod Harav.
Thank you. Thank you, Rav. Gmar Chatima Tova to everybody, and Dr. Windmueller, it's good to see you.
Rabbi, great to see you again.
I'm thinking of the title of Al Vorspan's old book, Start Worrying, Details to Follow, and thinking that anecdotally, I sense an awful lot of apocalyptic thinking among people of my generation, Jews of my generation, whether they be on the left or the right, that the fabric of the total political system will not be able to stand the stresses that's undergoing through all of the shocks and surprises and chicanery that is going on. Do you have any observations, whether out of your own heart or from the data or both, as to whether or not we're going to hell in a handbucket and ought to think about making Aliyah or going to Canada or something like that? Because that's what I hear.
Nobody's letting us into their countries right now anyway, so.
Rabbi Wenger, it's great to see you again, and thank you for that thoughtful and really important question. American Jews are thinking these deep thoughts, the challenging thoughts, as are French Jews, as are British Jews. There's a kind of machloket, a kind of dispute and contest over, so what is happening here and why is it happening? And of course, part of it is the combination of factors, the pandemic, the downturn in the economy, the crisis of governance, all of these together create even more of this sort of display of despair. I hear exactly what you have described, Jews talking about where do we go next and what does this mean for democracy in America. I think it's conceivable that we will go through some additional rough periods of reshaping the American democratic story. I'm not prepared to give up on it at all, and think that this moment may be an extraordinary time to refashion a lot of the pieces of democracy in America. The political party system, which I think is broken, civil discourse, which needs to be rebuilt, race and class relationships which need to be sustained, and certainly issues about how we care for people, whether it's healthcare, psychological and social services, and whether it is about the justice system as we have come to certainly recognize its challenges and threats. I think that we are at an extraordinary moment for our children and grandchildren to help re-envision what America was to be about and what it can become. We've never been, obviously, everything that we have articulated as our ideals, but we now have a moment to really bring to practice maybe some of these outcomes. So the bottom line here is I'm bullish on America as much as I am deeply concerned about the momentary core challenges.
Oh, with that, thank you. I want to give tremendous thanks to Dr. Windmueller. It's obviously why you are one of our go-to people here at Cole and Me. Everybody seems to always enjoy your presentations. They're very thought-provoking and always very relevant and timely too. So I want to give you a tremendous thank you for carving out some time on your very busy schedule to come talk with us. Thank you. And we certainly say to you, Gamar Khatima Tova, because we want you back. So all the best to you and Michelle, your wife, who I saw on here earlier too. And hopefully we'll see you again in Utah sometime soon. Thank you.
Take care.
I see our next speaker. Take care, Michelle. Good to see you. I see our next speaker is here. Let's take about 1-2 minutes just to do a quick stretch. If you have to go bathroom, go bathroom. And we will, it's 2:29 now. We will begin at 2:31. How about that? 2:31, 2:32. Yeah, more people joining the room. Fantastic. Great.
Hi, Rabbi Sam.
Hi, how are you doing, Dr. Haynes? Good to see you.
I'm doing great, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. I wanted to ask you, because I'm really new at this technology, like most people here.
We're learning on the fly.
I do have a PowerPoint.
Oh, great.
So could I share it?
Yeah, so what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to make you a co-host.
Oh, wonderful.
And then after I introduce you, you should now see at the bottom of your screen a little green button that says share screen
Yes,
in the Zoom.
Yes, exactly.
So when you click on that, then you can, we'll be able to see what's on your computer screen. So let's see. Brad Dichter, I'm loving that facial hair. Fantastic. Good to see you, my friend. Oh, hope everybody's doing all right. As Rabbi Wenger said, it's difficult to fast and pray with the refrigerator 5 feet from us. But hopefully you are having a meaningful day. And remember, don't make yourself sick.
Did you want to start view? Oh, you're on slideshow.
Yeah.
If you have trouble, you can try emailing it to me, and I can share my screen as I did with Dr. Windmueller. Hi, Evan. I see your hand up. I don't know if it was up for the last speaker or something now.
No, did you want to try to turn chat on?
That's a good question. Is there a way I can do that while I'm also learning this stuff on fly? I'm afraid I might have accidentally hit disable chat when I was setting this up. So I don't know if there's a way.
If you go to you should have a security icon at the bottom of your screen.
Security. Oh, there. Yes.
If you click on that,
yeah,
you might see chat, and you can just click on it.
Let me see. I don't see anything that says chat.
Okay.
I'm just terrified I'm going to do something and boot you all out.
We can always come back in.
All right. It's all good. Well, need be, just wave your hand. And all right. So.
All right. I think I may have to email it to you.
Okay. Go ahead if you want to email it to me.
Wait, no, you know what? I think it'll work. Okay. Let's see. Sorry.
No worries. If you want to do a test right now, we can do a quick test.
You got it.
But I have to share it.
Yeah, you have to share.
So let's see if this will work. I think this will work now.
Okay, feeling good about it.
Okay, getting there.
Well, while you do that, I will introduce our speaker. Oh, perfect. There you go. Great. Yeah, fantastic. So we can see
Now you
your
got it.
screen well. Thank you, Dr. Haynes. So let me introduce our next speaker. I'm very excited for. This is a topic that, like Dr. Windmueller's presentation, very timely and something similar to what I spoke about last night in my Kol Nidre sermon, and we've been discussing some as a community. So a little over, I just admit the folks in the waiting room. A little over a year ago, another one of my great professors I had in rabbinical school, Dr. Bruce Phillips, who was actually my thesis advisor, sent me Dr. Bruce Haynes's name and said, this is a good friend of mine who's a phenomenal presenter about Black Jews and the history of African American and Jewish American relations. And that is a particularly timely issue. So it's all been back in my head since Dr. Phillips recommended Dr. Haynes. It's been back in my head for over a year. And I said, what a great opportunity for a breakout speaker. So his presentation today is very appropriately with our Ne'ilah service this evening, called "The Gates Have Not Closed, Reviving the Black-Jewish Alliance." A good message of optimism. And so let me just let in more people. Everybody's joining now. So Bruce Haynes is a professor of sociology at the University of California, Davis, where he holds affiliations in geography, community development, and religious studies. After receiving his BA in sociology from Manhattanville College, Haynes conducted applied research under the sociologist Jay Schulman, selecting juries for high publicity trials throughout New York State. Dr. Haynes went on to earn his doctorate in sociology from the City University of New York in 1995 and was appointed assistant professor of sociology and African American studies at Yale University from 1995 to 2001. In 2001, he joined the faculty at the University of California, Davis, where he now serves as professor of sociology. His publications include Down the Up Staircase, 3 Generations of a Harlem Family, and The Soul of Judaism, Jews of African Descent in America. And the latter one was awarded the 2019 Albert J. Rabateau Book Prize for Best Book in Africana Religions. So it's a joy to welcome Dr. Haynes. Please, Dr. Haynes, take it away.
Well, thank you so much for that warm introduction, Rabbi. I'd like to begin first by thanking you for giving me this great honor to speak with you on such an important day. I'd also like to thank, although he's not present, your mentor and mine, Professor Phillips, down at Hebrew Union. He's been a great supporter of my work and my research, and we met serendipitously at a hotel lobby in the middle of a conference, and he took interest in my work. Little did I know how important he was in the field of Jewish studies, and I came to find he was not just important, he was a seminal player. And so I've been very lucky to been graced with his support. So listening to Professor Windmueller, I must say you planned this very well. I think what I have to say will fit neatly into some of the themes he talked about, particularly his messages about whiteness and talking about the crisis and talking about maybe trying to re-envision the future. But today I'm going to discuss the changing landscape of Judaism in the country, the increased visibility of Jews of African descent, along with Jews of color, that is biracial Jews, and Black Jews, those folks who have converted to Judaism, as well as folks who are born with one Jewish parent. Along with that are indigenous Black American groups who practice Judaism and sometimes refer to themselves as Hebrews or Israelites. So, the Jewish community, it is an evolving narrative. In the Mishnah, the term Yehudi, or its feminine singular Yehudit, or masculine plural Yehudim, appears in only 3 passages. In fact, the term Yehudim, which means Judeans, was an ethnogeographic term that was first used by Gentiles and Greek writers to refer to an imagined coveted nation in Judea. Meanwhile, the Jewish people refer to themselves as Israel. As Israelites in Western nations embraced the language of Gentiles and Greeks, they began to call themselves Jews. In the late 19th century, the concept of a religious covenant, which the term Israel represents, as well as the biblical term translated as Hebrew, were both superseded by the idea of a Jewish community, which integrated new ideas about Judaism from diasporic communities across Europe and the Americas. Defining the Jewish community in the modern era, in my own field of urban sociology, a sociologist from the University of Chicago, Louis Wirth, wrote a famous book titled The Ghetto in 1927. It seems a bit archaic now. Wirth said that Jews carried the ghetto on their backs into the suburbs. He talked about a particular archetypical ghetto. He talked about a typical archetypical Jew who resided within the ghetto. And in fact, early studies of the suburbs referred to gilded suburbs, meaning kind of the segregated nature of Jewish presence in the early post-war suburbs. That term was very much abandoned by the time we get to the 1960s and a shift to studies of Jewish communities. But over the past century, a number of things have been shaping the Jewish community, including globalization, immigration, assimilation, the acceptance of patrilineal descent amongst many American Jews, as well as the blurring of racial boundaries. And all of these things have fractured any single idea of a single coherent Jewish community. Today, more than ever, the term Jew, Judaism, Jewishness, and Hebrew have increasingly contested meanings within a uniquely American context, where the conflation of whiteness and Judaism can no longer be taken for granted. For the last 50 years, we've been watching the Jewish community and the landscape of Judaism in America transform. There's been increasing visibility of biracial Jews and Black converts to Judaism, and this has destabilized the historic Eurocentric view of Jews. Not to mention Mizrahi Jews, Yemenite Jews, and other diasporic communities, including the Ethiopian Jews, all coming to the West. At the same time, the reform movement, reforms adopted by Ethiopian Hebrews, and that is, I'm referring to the congregation known as the Commandment Keepers in New York City. Their International Board of Rabbis attested to reduce the hold of racism and race centrism on Black Hebrew Israelites. And back in the 1980s, they declared Judaism a non-religion. And for those who don't know, they send many of their members to yeshiva for training. They see themselves, much like the Baal Teshuvah, as returning Jews who have gone astray. But while Blackness remains a stigmatized status and a marker of identity here in the United States, the steady growth and normalization of Black Jews, as well as the tendencies towards some of these Ethiopian Hebrews, towards rabbinic style Judaism, just suggests that the answer that who is Jewish in America is in process of being rewritten, literally. And we were watching that transformation take place in many, many congregations. You know, when I started my research back in 1998, many of my Jewish friends would make the classic Sammy Davis Jr. joke, oh, you're gonna go study Sammy, as if that's the only Jew in, you know, the only Black Jew in America. And then after a few years, I had a number of people return to me and say, you know, I've gone back home and there's this couple in my congregation now, there's this family in my congregation now. And so very slowly, there's been this transformation that has, I think, kind of picked up speed of late. So a number of scholars have done studies of the Jewish community. First major study was done by the National Jewish Population Study back in 1971. It presumed a predominantly white, middle class, and German and Eastern European Jewish community in the US. Black Jews, along with Sephardic Jews and Ethiopian Jews, were labeled, quote, sub-communities, and they were considered to exist very much on the fringes of the Jewish community. But by 1990, folks down at CUNY Graduate Center did the National Jewish Population Survey. Up until that time, that was the most comprehensive study of the American Jewish population. It is a statistically representative sample. They sampled 5.8 million Jewish Americans, and out of that sample, to their surprise, mind you, some 125,000 individuals self-identified themselves as Black. Now, at the time, I thought it was interesting because I was doing my research a little bit later looking at this data, and they assumed that Sephardic Jews were labeling themselves, you know, checking the black box on the identity census question. And I thought to myself, that is so unlikely. I think you're beginning to pick up many of these other non-traditional Jews of African descent. So by 2012, folks up at Brandeis University did another fairly comprehensive study, again, statistically representative. They found 70,000 out of 4 million Jews, or 1.6%, who self-identified as Black. Now, one of the things that differs between these surveys is that the methodological approach that each team uses shapes who they define as Jewish. So the way in which the definition of Judaism and Jewishness gets defined in each survey actually shapes the outcome of how many Jews do we actually count in any survey. Interestingly, their numbers are close, but not too far off from the 1990 survey. And then in 2013, the Pew Research Center did another comprehensive survey where they estimated 1.7%, or 90,000 persons, who self-identified as non-Hispanic Black. Again, so now they have a different category. And again, their Black category in one survey may not be exactly comparable to the non-Hispanic Black category in another survey. And so this is one of the reasons why we get shifting in numbers, but we're getting a clear range that somewhere around 1, 2, 3% are African-American. And in fact, I have a more recent study from a group of scholars down at Stanford University, where they estimated 12 to 15% of American Jews to be Jews of color. And that was a study they did just recently back in 2016. And of course, if you ask, you know, congregations, you know, about the numbers in their congregations, often they tend to be inflated, and much is similar when we ask Black Jews themselves about how many numbers they estimate. The numbers are often a bit higher and some substantially higher than the formal surveys. The most reasonable guess, I think, is closer to the 200,000 rather than the 1.2 million. I think that's a bit of an exaggeration. But we are talking about Jews who are born of one Jewish parent, and we're also talking about Jews who are formally converted to Judaism. And lastly, as I mentioned before, there are indigenous African-American groups that refer to themselves as Hebrews or Israelites and identify with Judaism. And they run a range from anti-Semitic groups that are on the Southern Poverty Law Center Hate Watch, which are not the groups I'm talking about, to more traditional groups that recognize Mishnah, Torah, and see themselves as returning Jews, like the Ethiopian Hebrew congregation down there in New York. So no single Afro-Jewish identity exists. There are a number of different groups who self-identify as Jewish, and again, who does the counting will shape who gets included within any definition of, well, how many Black Jews are there, or how many Jews of color are there? And so definitions vary, but I think the number estimates that we're getting from the surveys are accurate and suggestive of radical change taking place in the Jewish community today. So the next section, I'm going to talk a little bit about Black-Jewish relations, a little bit about how they were yesterday. Saw it as a natural alliance. People refer to the NAACP. You know, and the Black-Jewish relations have often been idealized, although sometimes belittled. But the nostalgic look back to civil rights struggles of the 50s and 60s, when Jews reportedly made outside an oversized proportion of the whites who were involved in the bus registration and voter drives and bus boycotts and lunch counter sit-ins. And in fact, by one account, Jews made up at least half of the whites who were involved in the protest movement. Still others pointed to a fractured alliance. Jews have been accused of paternalism and abandoning their commitment to racial equality and justice, while Black Americans have been charged with embracing anti-Semitism and racial nationalism. And these frames have pushed the two communities further apart. But if we look into history, we'll see that Blacks and Jews have a strong parallel trajectory in the United States. They encountered one another in American metropolises of the late 19th century. Jews were fleeing persecution in Eastern Europe from the pogroms. Blacks were fleeing lynching and mob violence from the rural South, but not just across the rural South. Black folks were actually fleeing racial violence from half of America, because in fact, half of the counties in America between 1880 and the 1920s became all white. So we're really talking about Jews coming during a time color line was being drawn in America. Yet Jews, who themselves were viewed as racially distinct in Europe, were able to reframe themselves as ethnics here in the United States. And as such, they were seen as white within this emerging Black-white binary. The ability of Jews to cross the color line and wield economic power and political power, much like other whites in America, in fact, has stroked resentment from Black Americans. Most famously, James Baldwin wrote an essay back in 1967 entitled "Negroes Are Anti-Semitic Because They're Anti-White," in which he explained that the Negro is really condemning the Jew for having become an American white man for in fact having become Christian. So, the posts by Black celebrities, however, have been tapping into a fractured storyline of anti-Semitism that continues to cloud Black-Jewish relations today. And sadly, these posts echo conspiracy theories long held by white nationalists. And we're talking about Ice Cube, Deshaun Jackson, Larry Johnson, who have made some rather questionable statements about Blacks and Jews. And ironically, these posts echo refrains from white nationalists who have long engaged in conspiracy theories about the Jewish race. And as the speaker just before me pointed out, we are now seeing anti-Semitism not only from the right, but also from the left. So it goes beyond just assertions of Jewish control of banks or Jewish control of the media. As has been indicated now, we have the contradiction of Jews being caught between a rock and a hard place, you could say, in their ambivalent position as whites in American society. Anti-Semitism and racism move in tandem together, especially here in the United States. Violence against Jews and Blacks has risen, particularly since 2014, along with white nationalism. And I argue that the fates of Blacks and Jews are deeply entangled, now more than ever before. Both the 2015 mass shootings of Emmanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church down in South Carolina, and the more recent 2018 attacks of the Tree of Life Synagogue down in Pittsburgh, were all motivated by racism, by racist beliefs. Now more than ever, we need to renew our bonds and commitment to one another. Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, is considered by many the most important holiday in the Jewish faith. As the Jewish community transforms and Jews of color continue to grow among the ranks of American Jewry, could there be a better time for Blacks and Jews to reflect on past mistakes, to make amends with one another? Isn't it time for good deeds and the performance of teshuvah and a rekindling of the sacred alliance for justice and equity? God knows America needs it today more than ever. That's where I'll end. I'll open it up for questions. And let me see.
There we go. Let's see. I will stop the screen share. Thank you. That was really fascinating.
Thank you.
So I guess a question I have, people formulate their questions, is a question that, an issue that Dr. Windmueller touched on was that today, unlike about 50 years ago, today for the Jewish community, Israel is a very little issue, he said, in terms of how Jews vote. Only 4% of Jews put Israel as their #1 issue. With dealings between the Black and Jewish communities, it seems as though, at least in what I've observed, that Israel is a much more prevalent and touchy issue. On the side of I guess, for white Jewish people, when I've personally gotten a lot of pushback of my involvement in Black Lives Matter and stuff of this matter because of anti-Semitism that has creeped within the Black Lives Matter movement, and in particular, a statement from the platform from the Movement for Black Lives, a separate group that was very critical of Israel a couple years ago. And likewise, when I was in college and the head of the pro-Israel group in college, I found myself having trouble making inroads with the Black Student Union in a way that the Students for Justice in Palestine were able to do so because and something that I would hear from leaders of the Black Student Union was tremendous concerns over Israel and parallels between apartheid South Africa and Israel, and that creating a divide between the American the Black community in America and the Jewish community. So in typical rabbi fashion, this is a very long-winded question, which could have been summed up with, how does Israel play a role today, do you think, in Black Jewish relations in the United States?
Okay, so I think the first thing that we have to do when talking about Black Jewish relations is recognize, just like there is great diversity in the Jewish community, there is great diversity in the Black community. But there's a tendency for us to talk in very global terms of communities and as if everybody is representative of their community. So I think that's first problematic. So first I distinguish between the minority of people who supported the movement for Black lives versus the far larger Black Lives Matter movement. And often people confuse those two movements. So yeah, there is anti-Semitism, and the uninformed will in fact tap into it. And this is what I saw going on with some of the sports athletes who were getting information from less than reputable sources, but had little counter information by which to make judgments. So for instance, I grew up back in the 70s when they still taught about the Holocaust. When I took race relations in college, I in fact read The War Against the Jews. But if we go into colleges today, you'll find that when we talk about ethnicity, we really talk about the immigrants that have come since the 1980s. And that tends to mean that the conversation about Jews and anti-Semitism and that history of the Holocaust is not covered in the same way we used to cover it. And I think that is that allows people not to fully understand the complicated history of Jews in the United States.
Yeah.
I'm trying to think. The other issue that you touched on, I think, is the issue of power. And I think sometimes Black anti-Semitism really is a frustrated manifestation of resenting Jews for having political power. And when I say that, I guess I could use the Holocaust Museum as a good example. African Americans who've had a long history of oppression and slavery, there was a long time before there was any recognition of that officially by the society. Yet Jews politically and financially were able to amass the politics to make the Holocaust Museum real. And so for Blacks, there was this sense of, well, how come they get to have their issue heard, but our issue doesn't get heard? So I do think there is a constant replay of a certain power dynamic that allows us to ignore the history of anti-Semitism and how deeply related anti-Semitism and racism are to white supremacy in America. The last speaker touched on the white supremacy, and I actually think that's where our conversation has to head right now. American society seems to think that it's only the bad apples that are the problem. You know, the marchers down in South Carolina, the people who take the extreme on the question of race and nationalism. But it seems, in fact, the willingness of us to live within a white structured society where segregation still dominates virtually every facet of our life, particularly with regards to education. That is where the rubber meets the road when it comes to questions of equity and equality.
Thank you. Let's see, I want to give folks, is there anybody who didn't get a chance last time to ask a question with Dr. Windmueller who has a question this time? I want to. Yeah, I see Matthew Weinstein.
Hi, okay. So I guess my question would be, I don't know, maybe I tend to be a little bit of a Pollyanna about this. I think there's a case to be made.
Matthew, I can barely hear you.
Oh, sorry. How about
There you
now?
go.
Is that me better?
That's better.
Yes.
Okay. So I think there's a case to be made that the Black-Jewish relationship in America is thriving. And the best place maybe where that is the case is the Democratic Party. I mean, I'm from the state of Maryland, where I think the Democratic Party is mostly Blacks and Jews. And it's, you know, the ruling party in that state. Another example might be Barack Obama. His rise and success was so much the product of a Black-Jewish partnership in Chicago, you know, politics, in Illinois politics. So is there any case, do you think, Dr. Haynes, to make for that case that there is a thriving relationship going on in some instances?
I think that relationship has never gone away. But I think other relationships have maybe taken the spotlight away from those relationships. I think one of the reasons why, in fact, I started writing about Black-Jewish relations because I found myself in that situation, hearing conversations about conflicts between Blacks and Jews, yet having had my own experiences. My first mentor, as was mentioned by the rabbi, was Jay Shulman, a Jewish intellectual, radical social scientist who really transformed my life. And so it was recognizing that, wow, despite these side conversations of tension that were in the news media, for instance, back in 1995, my experiences were very different. And so I wanted to start talking about those. And I think the most profound thing that came to me when I first started writing with a scholar named Phil Kasinitz was that, in fact, there's this tendency to talk about these two amazingly diverse communities as if they are these two holistic entities. There's the Black community over here and the Jewish community over here, and as if any one member could speak for anybody else. And that is ludicrous, but yet we do this all the time. So for instance, if a person with a Jewish surname, vis-a-vis Mr. Farrakhan, the person with a Jewish surname is connected to the slave trade. Well, this is evidence of Jewish presence in the slave trade, but whether or not that person is practicing Judaism is irrelevant, right? It's the signifier of Judaism. And so we often are not really talking about facts so much as some of the myths in which the communities see each other with by talking in such global terms. So you could argue there is no single Black community. There is no single Black Jewish community. There are multiple Jewish communities. I couldn't find any agreement among Jewish synagogues just in Brooklyn, much less trying to find agreement across Jews across America. And it's the same for Black folks. And so this notion that Blacks are a group maybe goes back also to this notion of why white America fears Black folks in the first place. I mean, this is the very rhetorical strategies the president's been using when he says, look, they're coming to your suburbs. You know, they're coming to a theater near you. This is scapegoating, race baiting, and these are things that we have to address if we're ever going to get to the bottom of relations between Blacks and Jews.
Thank you. Very interesting. Let's see. I see Pamela Silberman has a question.
Hi. It's more of a comment or an observation than a question. I think this is so interesting. And one of the things that I've been thinking about is the reason why this ability to create this kind of monolithic view of Jews or Blacks is because many Americans have no actual connection to Jews or Blacks. They don't live in communities together. And what I think about is, like, when I lived in New York in the 90s, and the sort of model for Black Jewish relations was what happened in Crown Heights between Hasidic Jews and Blacks in Crown Heights. And then that became sort of the framework for Black Jewish relationships because it was so public. And I also think about when you think about representations of Jews in the media, it's often a Hasidic Jew, right? And that's sort of the shorthand that we use to indicate a Jew, which most of us, many of us feel less connection with that community than maybe even non-Jews because that's not part of our life experience. And so I think that's part of the problem. And I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, is that Jews, like Blacks, the vast majority of Americans have no actual relationship with Jews and maybe have never met a Jew or spent any time. And so it's easy to fall into these shorthand stereotypes of representation of monolithic community when, as you point out, it's extremely diverse in both cases.
I think you make a really, really important point. When I first started doing my research, now, this is someone who had a Jewish mentor. I went to a Jewish prep school in Manhattan. My first girlfriend was Jewish as a kid, and I have a Jewish wife. And needless to say, when I went out into the field and started interacting with Jews from different communities, the thing that shocked me the most was the openness of the Orthodox community. And this was something I grew up with in New York, right? New Yorkers always talking, and I have plenty of Jewish friends who'll talk about the folks in the black hats and how they're clannish and this and that. And then I started having experiences where those frames didn't fit. One experience was I was at a hotel in the early part of my research. So I'm still trying to figure out, what is Judaism and what is a Jew and what does this all mean? So we happened to be in a hotel, and there was a big Orthodox wedding going on upstairs. So I snuck away from my wife and party and went to kind of snoop around doing my field research. And lo and behold, the mother of the bride comes out into the hallway and sees me hanging out and starts talking to me. And I tell her I'm doing research. She says, "Oh, you want to learn about Jews? Come on in." And to my surprise, takes me into the wedding, takes me over to the men's side, drops me off and says, "See ya." And I sort of was in shock. I had never been to an Orthodox wedding before. This was a new experience for me. I knew enough to know that I can't go across the room. I knew that much. But I was in shock. I thought, wow, what a different interaction I had with this woman. And I got to say, I had multiple interactions. This is just an example. I've had Orthodox rabbis who told me that I should convert. I said, "Hey," they said, you would never say this," right? So there are so many of these kind of tropes that are out there about who both of these communities are that are so false and incorrect. And I'll give just one other story. I used to live in Yonkers, New York, right on the border of the Bronx and Yonkers. And there was one day, there was a holiday, and there was these two Hasidic young men who were hanging out in the bus stop across the street. And I knew the buses were not running that day. And I was off from work. And so I decided to go over and tell them that the bus wasn't working. And so they were stuck. And I ended up driving these two young men downtown. And we had a fascinating conversation about Orthodox Judaism and the rock and roll bands that these two young men were playing in their Orthodox synagogue. And I thought, wow, this was not supposed to happen. These kinds of interactions were not possible in the way that people frame Black-Jewish relations.
Thank you. Wow, what unique experiences. Other questions? Liz, please.
Thank you for that question, by the way. That was a great question.
Professor Haynes, I'm wondering if you could speak to kind of the phenomenon of the book White Fragility and whether or not that conversation should resonate within the predominantly white Jewish community, or is that taking us off base?
It's interesting.
If you could give a little context to it too, for those of us who haven't read the book.
Well, there are two big books, I guess, that have come out. One is the How to Be an Anti-Racist book, and the other is the White Fragility book, right? And I think there are important starts to a conversation. But one of the things I fear, you know, Americans act as if we are having this conversation for the first time. But in fact, this is not the first time, even during my lifetime, that we've had this conversation. And as I was saying to my community here, Black folks are frustrated. You know, folks who have been discriminated against across generations are frustrated because there's a tendency to turn to them to solve your problem, so to speak. So for instance, I've been taxed quite a bit at work to be on this committee, to be on that committee, to give my opinion on this and that and this and that. And I think, you know, does any of this really matter? Because if you're not going to do systemic changes, that changes the power relationships. Because that's what we're talking about. Whiteness gives access to wealth accumulation. Blackness gives access to poverty and ghettoization. So, you know, so this is what we're talking about. And so it's going to take more than liberal platitudes of, you know, signs. I mean, I love my town here in Davis. It's awesome. It's very liberal. I've got Black Lives Matter signs all over town. But I said to myself this morning when I passed one, that I should write on the bottom that, you know, people need to give up the wealth and the power, and that will make that sign realistic. But just to put a sign to say, you know, I'm against racism, wonderful, and I'm going off to my country club, changes nothing. So we really are talking about power transformation when we're talking about equity. We're not talking about transforming identities. We're not talking about simply getting rid of nasty, bigoted attitudes of anti-Semitism and racism. We're talking about leveling the playing field. We're talking about equal opportunity. Some of the things that almost sound old-fashioned in the political environment in which we currently exist.
Okay. Let's see, I'm going to go Jackie and then Rabbi Wenger. And any other questions, just put up your hand if you have others. And Susan Schulman. Okay, so we'll take those three.
Susan, I don't know if you're related to Jay Schulman or not, but I don't know. Just have to ask.
I'm not. I've never heard of him before this breakout session.
Well, you come from a good family.
Cool.
Good name. All right, let's go Jackie. And then
Yes, I just wanted to know what you thought about reparations, if you thought that was a good way to start moving towards some sort of balance of power.
You know, I believe we need reparations, but, you know, I go one step further. I really believe that America needs a truth and reconciliation kind of approach to dealing with racism, to dealing with the problem of slavery, the embeddedness of whiteness within the Constitution. And if we can't talk about those things, I don't think we will ever solve these problems. And I think that's the heart, you know, that's where the rubber meets the road, so to speak.
what do you see, just follow up to that, because at the last Union for Reform Judaism biennial, they endorsed, the union endorsed a resolution supporting reparations, but they left it very open-ended, whether that was monetary payment or whether that was an official apology from the United States government or some other thing.
Well, we already got the apology from Clinton, I believe. He gave an apology way back when and said, you know, sorry for Tuskegee, sorry for slavery, you know. But, you know, if you're
is that monetary reparations that when you say yes to reparations?
It has to be institutional. I mean, and at the heart of it, let's face it, we're really talking about residential segregation. The heart of inequality to the whole structure is residential segregation. So that shapes voting, that shapes school segregation, that shapes where we work, where we play, where we are even buried. And so I would say if we were willing to address segregation, and we're talking about not just racial, but also economic segregation. Those two linchpins have been driving Americans further and further apart for 30 years, both racially and economically. In fact, I would go so far to suggest that maybe that's why we're having such a strained political conversation now, because in fact, wealth gap is beyond any place it's ever been in the nation's history.
Rabbi.
Are you aware, Professor, of any conversations or literature or studies about traditional Jewish anti-Black feelings or expressions, stereotype feelings, die Schwarze, or all of the things that are in the rabbinic literature? I appreciate the fact you began with the Mishnah, essentially shaping white Jewish attitudes of negative feelings towards Blackness.
You know, I really feel that most of Jewish attitudes towards Blackness has to do with Jews and colonialism. In my book, I trace the contact between Africans and Jews back to the 1300s. And one of the things that seems clear to me, at least from my perspective, is that Jews were fleeing persecution, religious persecution in Europe, and in the middle of a colonial expansion, found themselves going to Caribbean islands as middlemen in the expansion of colonialism and slavery. And that placed Jews in an interesting position as sometimes as slave traders, but also in places like Suriname, you had the construction of multiracial Jewish communities. And I picked Suriname because it's the most well-documented because of the Nassi family and their involvement with Suriname. And so there you had a multiracial Jewish community that actually split off from the main Ashkenazi, or actually Sephardic community that was there. And so what that showed me is that the racial attitudes that I think modern Jews have adopted basically have emerged out of colonialism of the 18th and 19th century. And as Jews tried to become included, because remember the question of Europe and of the late 19th century, could Jews become part of these nation states, these new nations? And people saw Jews as a race, as an unassimilable race. And so one could argue that as the color line was being drawn at the late 19th century, it was Jewish intellectuals like Horace Cayton and others who reframed Jewishness as hyphenated, as something you could be two things. You could be Jewish and American, as opposed to this notion that Jews were a nation unto themselves and therefore unassimilable. And ironically, Jews were able to cross the color line, and it was Black folks who are now permanently behind the indelible boundary of race.
Thank you. Susan.
Great question, thank you.
Let's see, I'll go Susan and then John. Go ahead, Susan.
So as a fundamentally short-sighted person, I'd like to know what specific actions you'd like to see happen today and in the near future, especially in a small Jewish community like this one, like ours, so that the Black-Jewish Alliance can be revived.
Great question. Thank you for that. And I hope you'll take my answers seriously.
Oh, I will. I will.
And so I think the biggest thing now is, right, everybody, there's a lot of attention to the issue, and people are reading books and people are having conversations, and I think this is wonderful. But I think we have to go beyond the quote rap sessions that we had back in the 70s. You know, we had the conversations back then, we're having the conversations again. We need to go beyond conversation. And so what I would argue or suggest, and I made the same suggestion to my rabbi here in Davis, which is for him to use his network to reach out to search for groups or organizations or churches who are engaged in activities that you feel that you could support, and reach out to a group and say, hey, we're here, we have resources, what can we do? And there's a tendency for people to say, and come to me literally and say, Bruce, you know, could we find some folks that want to have a conversation? And my response was, I gotta say, Black folks are tired of the conversation. We're tired of having to be responsible for appeasing white guilt over a history of violent discrimination. And that's really what we're talking about. So it really means people have to come to terms with their own complacency in a system of inequality. Just no different than men who have to come to terms with their power within a structured society that privileges men over women.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for the question.
John Mertens.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Go ahead.
You can hear me, right? I think
I can hear you just fine.
Oh, good. I thought I took it off mute. Earlier you mentioned that that you saw whiteness as wealth and whiteness is access to wealth and blackness is access to poverty. So I was going to ask you.
Well, not access to poverty. There's this distinction. Okay.
Sorry if I misquoted you.
Access to wealth and denial of access to wealth.
Denial of access.
The consequence of that denial is poverty.
Fair enough. And so I was going to ask you what specifically is holding that distinction line. I believe that you answered that question, and if you didn't, I believe you answered that question with residential segregation. And so,
Precisely.
So my next question was going to be, how do we as a society, how do you see us how would we address residential segregation?
You know, that's a great question. I think it requires hard choices. I'll give you an example. When I was teaching at Yale, Deborah Davis, who was the only Jewish senior tenured member at that point in time in the sociology department, her and her husband, Michael Friedman, had chosen to place their child in the New Haven public school system. That's what I'm talking about. They made a conscious decision to not privilege their child in the way that whiteness would encourage one to do, right? Which is basically take the kid out of the school system and put him in a white school, put him in a prep school or private school. The same is true with a good friend of mine here in Davis. In fact, Dr. David Siegel, who is internal medicine at the Sacramento Veterinary Hospital. They used to live down in Oakland. And when he and his wife, both doctors, when they lived in Oakland with their firstborn son, those children went to the public schools there. And he's quite proud of the fact that, and they all became doctors, by the way. He's got 3 doctors and 1 lawyer for his son. So it didn't sacrifice their success. But he also raised kids that have a lot more social consciousness than the average kid had they gone to a segregated white environment.
All right.
Thank you. I think we have time for one last question.
These are wonderful questions, by the way. So I
They
really
are.
appreciate them.
I think we have time for one more question. Want to see if there's anybody who hasn't asked one yet who wants to. Just put your hand up or, okay. In that case, then, I don't see any hands going up of people who haven't asked one. I do see a question from Liz. So Liz, you get the final question.
Well, I just wanted to follow up on John's question and your response, Dr. Haynes. I mean, the Jewish parents have always historically, the studies show, chosen public schools over private schools for their children. So what's the next step then?
Oh boy. You know, this is where I think I was agreeing with the last speaker when he said we're at a crisis moment, and maybe crisis gives us the ability to reimagine how we want our society to be. We have deeply entrenched structural problems. You know, segregation is not going away overnight. The wealth gap is not going away overnight. But I do believe if we're not conscious to these problems, then we're not going to work on them. Half the nation seems to be pushing us in the other direction, you know, away from senses of justice, away from equality, away from support for the environment. away from support for women, for workers. So I feel like all of those are the wrong direction that the nation should be heading in. And again, I think it goes back to the way in which nativism and whiteness are at the basis for the coalition that the right is able to hold together. And I think if we don't understand or see the link between the president's rhetoric about Muslims, about Jews, about people of color, and understand that these rhetorics are connected, I think we are all done for.
Well, on that happy, cheerful note, but no, I mean, I appreciate that you're also saying that this is an opportunity, and I think that that's so much of what Yom Kippur talks to us about is and the high holidays is that, like it says in the Torah, we have choices in front of us, blessing or cursed. I'll let you come to your own conclusion about which side you think the blessing is and which side the curse is, so that I don't endanger our 501c3 status, but you could come to your own conclusion. But I think that that's what you're saying too, of that we're at this very unique opportunity right now is so very true. And
well, I really want to commend your congregation for even thinking to reach out to me. I must say, it's not typical to choose to get into the difficult questions. And I think that's exactly what we're going to have to do if we're going to transform and make the society that we all would like to have.
Thank you. I agree 100%. I think that that's what we're supposed to do, is use this to wrestle with these tough questions. And with both of our speakers today, I'm walking away with a lot of questions and a lot of insight. And I could not be, as rabbi, more pleased with how both of Dr. Windmueller and Dr. Haynes' presentations came to be, and how they connect to not only issues we're struggling with today, but our Jewish values and what we're thinking about during these high holidays. So I want to give a big thank you to Dr. Haynes.
Thank you so much for inviting me, and I wish I could meet you all in person, but I wish you all safety in the coming months, and make sure you all vote. Of course, we know we need to do that.
Go vote. Absolutely. That's a message I certainly endorse, is go vote. And hopefully we will get the opportunity to have you here in person one day in the future, Dr. Haynes. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Rabbi Spector. Real pleasure.
Thank you to everybody for joining us today. Great turnout.
For the great questions.
Yeah, and great turnout for both sessions. And we'll be at 5 o'clock starting our Mincha service. I see Jackie on here. I know she'll be giving us a great teaching on Jonah, as she does every year. And at 6 o'clock ish is when with the same link, is when our what I think is this year a very meaningful Yizkor service will start. A little after 6 actually. And then a little bit after 7, we're switching to live to go Ne'ilah, like you might have seen in our announcements. Unfortunately, as our state is now spiking at unprecedented levels of COVID, we had to cancel any in-person stuff for that, which is very disappointing, but the responsible decision. And so, but you can watch us live. Go to the link to watch us live. It might take a moment to switch. So if it's still dark, just refresh that screen in a few minutes and you'll see us live. But thank you, everybody, for joining. Gemar Chatima Tova. Thank you again, Dr. Haynes, and hope I see you all very soon.
Thank you all.
Bye.